Imagine if you were banished from the only community you had ever known. No one is allowed to communicate with you, to read anything written by you. They're not even allowed to go within 6 feet of you. You are a pariah. This experience is part of the life story of Spinoza, who was formally excommunicated from his Jewish community in Amsterdam in 1656 at the young age of 23. This was a community of Jews that had fled persecution in Portugal, and they were cosmopolitan in some ways. But Spinoza was beyond the pale. The formal writ by which Spinoza was excommunicated referred, non-specifically, mind you, to his evil opinions, his abominable heresies, even his monstrous deeds. So what could have possibly provoked this extreme reaction? And this was extreme for them. There were two main factors. One is that Spinoza was developing a philosophy which was scandalous to his community. And this is a philosophy that would go on to help and birth the Enlightenment, that period stretching into the next century, the 18th century, that's focused on reason, the individual's pursuit of his own happiness, and political freedom. This is a period that culminated in the founding of America. The other factor is that Spinoza spoke up and refused to back down. He was willing to defend his ideas, even if it meant excommunication. Or thereafter, even if it meant continual threats from the wider Christian world in the form of jail or even being killed. Uh, Spinoza was savvy enough and lucky enough to avoid those fates, but we'll talk about that as we go along. Spinoza is a hero of the Enlightenment, not in some purely intellectual sense in that he held Enlightenment ideas, although he did, but also morally, in that he was willing to defend these ideas despite the attendant dangers. It is not an exaggeration to say that Spinoza is one of the most courageous men in 17th century Europe. It is also not an exaggeration to say that Spinoza's ideas are opposed to objectivism in many ways, and I will briefly flag a few examples of that as I go along. Feel free to ask me about any of those in the Q&A. Still, Spinoza is one of the relative good guys in history. And at a conference where we are honoring the Enlightenment and the founding of America, it is more than worthwhile to honor and to learn about the major Enlightenment figure that is Spinoza. In my brief time this morning, I'm going to be speaking with you about 3 Enlightenment themes that are in Spinoza's philosophical system: his rational critique of religion, his egoism, and his defense of freedom of thought. I'm going to start with Spinoza's rational critique of religion. More than anything else, this is what earned him his status as a pariah, both within as well as outside his Jewish community. Now, regarding the latter, as far as how he cemented his pariah status to the wider Christian world, in 1670, Spinoza published a book entitled Theological Political Treatise. Theological Political Treatise. He published it anonymously, though people had their suspicions. And the book scandalized Europe. One commentator at the time said that it was, quote, full of studious abominations and an accumulation of opinions which have been forged in hell, which every reasonable person, indeed every Christian, should find abhorrent, close quote. And that is only one among many such denunciations from the time. And by the way, if you want to read some Spinoza, and I definitely recommend spending some additional time with this remarkable mind, the Theological Political Treatise is a pretty good place to start. It's just ahead of its time in terms of anticipating the Enlightenment and beyond. We will get to the political part of the theological political treatise later, but what were these theological ideas that amounted to a rational critique of religion? At the foundation of Spinoza's theology is his view that God is nature. God is nature. So there is no supernatural realm, supernatural being beyond nature that lords over, that controls, that created nature. There's just nature. And in this regard, Spinoza is even more radical than traditional Enlightenment doctrine, which usually allows for at least some sort of supernatural God. Now, Spinoza would say, and he did say, that he is a true defender of God and of religion. But in fact, what Spinoza was doing is he was gutting religion of much of its content, which is why people were so scandalized. For example, there are and can be no miracles for Spinoza. Not if by a miracle we mean a violation of a law of nature. Why? Well, there is no being beyond nature to effect such a violation. There's no higher authority here to intervene. Again, there's just nature. Nature and her laws, which are sovereign and ironclad. Of course, there are things that we don't currently understand, or we don't currently have an explanation for. Spinoza acknowledges that. But that there is a rational, causal, this worldly explanation must always be true for Spinoza. Even something like the human body, which would often be put forward by theists as an example par excellence of something that must have been designed, must have been the product of some sort of divine will. Spinoza says no, he holds firm. In a remarkable passage, he writes the following. When they, those supernaturalists, see the structure of the human body, they are struck by a foolish wonder. And because they do not know the causes of so great an art, they infer that it is constructed, not by mechanical, but by divine or supernatural art. Hence it happens that one who seeks the true causes of miracles and is eager, like an educated man, to understand natural things, not to wonder at them, like a fool, is generally considered an impious heretic and denounced as such by those whom the people honor as interpreters of nature and the gods. Close quote. So here's Spinoza, writing 200 years before Charles Darwin in his theory of evolution. And Spinoza is not merely floating the idea that maybe the human body wasn't designed, maybe it's the product of purely material causes. No, he's claiming certainty that this is true. And he's saying if you disagree with him, you're a fool. You can start to see why Spinoza ruffled a few feathers. Now, an immediate reason that people were so scandalized by Spinoza is the Bible, which has a lot to say about God and miracles and so on, that Spinoza was flying into the teeth of. Spinoza had a very clear answer here. The Bible says many things which are false. Let me repeat that. The Bible says many things which are false. Again, this was a truly remarkable stance to take for its time. Even someone like Galileo, who's about a generation or two before Spinoza, they overlapped by about 10 years. Even someone like Galileo, a hero like Galileo, did not take the stance. When Galileo maintained that the earth revolves around the sun and was condemned by the church on that basis, part of Galileo's response was to say that he is maintaining consistency with the Bible. We just need to reinterpret those passages of the Bible that seem to imply that the sun revolves around the earth such that they're consistent with modern science. Spinoza says, no, we don't. No, we don't. The premise that Galileo shared with the church is that everything that the Bible says is true. And that premise, says Spinoza, is nonsense. It's nonsense. The Bible was written by largely ignorant, primitive people who had certain important moral truths to share, Spinoza stresses. But if you're going to the Bible for philosophical or for scientific truth otherwise, you are going to be sorely disappointed. So, in this way, what Spinoza is doing is he's helping to free the human mind from the shackles of Scripture. The Bible is not an authority that reason has to answer to. Now, it should be acknowledged that the reason of Spinoza is not the reason of objectivism. For Spinoza, the highest form of reason involves a kind of intellectual insight that is not based on the senses, and that is certainly nothing that objectivism could accept. However, in his rational critique of religion, Spinoza is making use of a better kind of reason, and he's certainly making room for a better kind of reason, thus helping to lead to the Enlightenment. I mentioned that for Spinoza, the Bible contains certain important moral truths. What is true in morality for Spinoza? Well, this brings me to the second point. Spinoza is an ethical egoist. He holds that virtue consists in your pursuing your own self-interest, your own happiness. For example, he writes, "The more each one strives and is able to seek his own advantage, that is, to preserve his being, the more he is endowed with virtue." Close quote. Pretty good, right? Here's another example. And this quote will give you a little bit of a broader taste as far as this ethical theory is concerned. Quote, "Acting absolutely from virtue is nothing else in us but acting, living, and preserving our being," these three signify the same thing, "by the guidance of reason from the foundation of seeking one's own advantage." Close quote. I remember the first time I ever read that passage, I almost fell over. In one sentence, Spinoza is giving you the ultimate value in ethics, that's life, the ultimate virtue, rationality, or the guidance of reason, and the ultimate beneficiary, the self, seeking one's own advantage. I mean, from an objectivist perspective, this is truly remarkable stuff. Now, as with reason, so with self-interest. Spinoza's understanding is not that of objectivism. For Spinoza, the highest form of self-interest is going to involve significant downplaying of various sort of material goods and material pursuits and material pleasures. And again, ultimately, this is nothing that objectivism could countenance. Nonetheless, if you're looking for a statement, not only of the pursuit of happiness, but of the moral rectitude of the pursuit of happiness in this period, you would be hard-pressed to find a more explicit statement than you find in Spinoza. And to go a step further, outside of objectivism, you would be hard-pressed to find more explicitly egoistic statements in the entire history of philosophy. Let's turn to the final point, which is Spinoza's defense of freedom of thought. In order to understand and appreciate Spinoza's ideas in this regard, we have to consider the kind of world in which he lived in, which is a world that was ravaged by the lack of such freedom. For instance, Spinoza was born smack dab in the middle of the 30 Years' War. This is a war that waged from 1618 to 1648. Spinoza was born in 1632. So he grew up in a world where millions of people across Central Europe were slaughtering each other in this religious conflict. And that's just one example, although a very large example, of the kind of world that he lived in. And on a more immediately personal level, Spinoza lived his entire life under the urgent need to be cautious about what he said and to whom. He had a signet ring that was inscribed upon it the word cate, which is Latin for caution or beware. He knew that one false move, saying the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time, could land him in jail, even get himself killed. And he was not imagining things in this regard. Consider a few examples as they pertain to some of his associates, and this is all from after his excommunication. So one of his associates, Adrian Korbach, was arrested for publishing Spinozistic ideas under his, that is, under Korbach's own name. He died in prison. Another one of Spinoza's associates, Johann de Witt, who was also a powerful political figure at the time, who was more friendly to Spinoza, Johann de Witt, along with de Witt's brother, were attacked, killed, and cannibalized by an angry mob. As the story has come down to us, Spinoza had to be physically restrained by his landlord from running headlong into the fray, holding a sign with the word barbarians blazoned upon it. The signet ring was apparently not very effective in that moment, and understandably so. Another one of Spinoza's associates, Nicholas Steno, actually betrayed Spinoza. What did he do? Well, nothing much, except for the fact that he delivered a copy of one of Spinoza's unpublished works to the Roman Inquisition. And this wasn't any of Spinoza's unpublished works. This was a book of his called Ethics, which is the systematic statement of his philosophy, and which he would choose not to publish in his lifetime due to various dangers which were swirling. I could go on, but you get the idea. And this is all happening, by the way, in the Dutch Republic, which, comparatively speaking, was one of the more tolerant places at the time. That's why Spinoza's family moved there to begin with. So Spinoza was resolved. We need a very different kind of society. As he asked, what can be more calamitous than that men should be regarded as enemies and put to death, not for any crime or misdeed, but for being of independent mind? Close quote. The question answers itself. Instead, and as Spinoza put it, man should be able to think as he pleases and to say what he thinks. And by this, Spinoza did not mean man should be able to think as Spinoza pleases and say what Spinoza thinks. He wanted independent minds. He wanted a robust marketplace of ideas where people can discuss, debate, disagree. By the very nature of such an enterprise, sometimes people are going to say things which are false. But, says Spinoza, that is the price of doing business. That is what is required if rational ideas are going to flourish. So there's a lot of good in and around Spinoza's views on freedom of thought. There's also less good. Ultimately, Spinoza is not consistent on this point in allowing for this freedom, fundamentally because he does not hold it as a right or as a principle. For that, and for the full flowering of Enlightenment political thought, we'd have to wait for a generation later for the writings of John Locke. But Locke did not come out of nowhere. Spinoza is an important part of the story as far as how these better Enlightenment ideas were ultimately developed and were able to take hold. And if you want to ask me about Spinoza's influence on Locke in the Q&A, feel free to do so. That's a whole discussion in itself. Unfortunately, Spinoza did not live to see these better ideas proliferate. He was of failing health and died in 1677 at the age of 44. So Spinoza would not live to see his works take on increasing importance. They're being passed around Europe and read in secrecy by men such as Locke. His works serving as an undercurrent, helping to move the West towards the Enlightenment. He would not live to see the Enlightenment fully take hold, and of course would not see its culmination in the founding of America. When Spinoza was excommunicated at the young age of 23, he had no country like America to turn to. But it is because of men like him that we now live in a very different world. The story of Spinoza is a reminder that the Enlightenment is a sacred achievement, and that we, like Spinoza, must fight for it, no matter how many are against us. Thank you. Yes, ER.
Maimonides is the philosopher who brought Aristotelian views of rationality into the Jewish culture, I was wondering if Spinoza is influenced by Aristotle and how.
Yeah, really good question. So, I'll start with Maimonides. So, yes, one of Spinoza's influences, he was fairly eclectic in terms of the things he was reading, but certainly one of his influences was Maimonides. So, Maimonides was a medieval Jewish thinker. Spinoza cites Maimonides a fair amount in his theological political treatise. You're absolutely right that Maimonides has a lot of Aristotle in him, and I suspect that not only was Spinoza influenced by Aristotle, but that he's getting a significant amount of that through Maimonides. I also suspect Spinoza was reading Aristotle directly. He had Aristotle in his library. We actually have a catalog of Spinoza's library, so we have some sense of the books that he had and he might have been reading. Aristotle was included in that. But I think it has to be clear whether directly or indirectly that Spinoza was influenced by Aristotle. If you think of what Dr. Peikoff talks about in the epilogue of Opar, the grand duel between Plato and Aristotle, uh, Spinoza's got a lot of both in him. So there's no question that Aristotle is an important part of the story as far as how understanding how a figure like Spinoza could have existed. No, yeah,
Thank you, Alex. I enjoyed your talk very much.
thank you.
I'm just wondering about Spinoza's idea of God being nature. Is this an idea that was floating around at the time, or is this his theological innovation, if we could think of it like that?
Yeah, I don't wanna claim it was absolutely original to him, but certainly in this period, in the milieu in which he was functioning, it was very radical. Again, it was even radical for the 18th century to reject, the supernatural, which is essentially what this idea is. So yeah, again, I don't want to claim that it's completely original, but you should really hear it as Spinoza is going way off the map in terms of the kind of theological view that would be accepted during this time. And that's part of why people found him to be so scandalous. He was branded as an atheist. Of course, Spinoza vehemently disagreed with that view, um, but yeah, no, you should not see this as anything like a standard view for that time. Yeah. Yeah.
Did Spinoza have any awareness of a conflict between morality and determinism? And I'd also be interested to hear about his influence on Locke.
Okay, okay. Yeah, so, what you might be referring to is that Spinoza was a determinist. So, just about for everything good I can say about Spinoza, there's an equal and opposite, perhaps more than equal, thing that Spinoza says that undercuts a lot of his better views, and determinism is one such, point. I don't get a sense from Spinoza that he really saw much of a conflict here. He called his what he thought of as his magnum opus, his systematic statement of his philosophy. He called it ethics. I mean, that this is what he saw himself as doing. So no, I don't he thought as much of a conflict, as wrong as he might have been about that. Um, yeah, briefly regarding Locke. So my view is that Spinoza had some sort of non-trivial effect on Locke. I say that as a likelihood, not as a certainty. So just to set the stage a little bit, Spinoza and Locke were born the same year, 1632. But Spinoza's works were much earlier. Again, Spinoza died by 1677. Locke's works were the ones for which he's best known, like the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, two treatises concerning civil government, Letter Concerning Toleration. Those are all 1689, 1690, and then Locke has more works after that too. So while they're born the same year, there is some temporal ordering here with Spinoza being first. Locke, we know had Spinoza's works. He seems to have read them to some extent. We actually have little notes from him that indicate that. And I just one way to see Spinoza's influence on the Enlightenment is he was just a massive envelope pusher. He would take some Enlightenment theme that was percolating, and Spinoza would just take it to its consistent conclusion, like with miracles, which I was mentioning, where it's just there are no miracles. We can we can explain everything. People say, whoa, wait a minute, I don't really want to go that far. But for the more honest people, like Locke, I think Spinoza was planting seeds. He was saying, okay, maybe I don't want to go as far as Spinoza, but maybe Spinoza's pushing me to go farther than I'm currently going. Because after all, the Spinoza guy, I can at least admit in my own mind, even if I won't admit it out loud, that he's actually not crazy. And it's actually not obvious how to answer his arguments. So I think given that status that Spinoza had, and given Locke's status as a generally honest broker, I just find it hard to believe that Locke didn't have something of a soft spot for Spinoza, and that Locke wasn't pushed by Spinoza in some meaningful directions in this regard. That's all very general. I'm not able to give you specifics because it's not like Locke was telling everyone, okay, here are the 7 things I got from Spinoza, because you didn't compliment Spinoza in polite company. He was a pariah. He was radioactive. So I can't give you specifics, or at least can't give you specifics without a very, very long, conversation. But I do think there was some sort of influence there. I should also mention as one last thing, just on this point, for those who look into the Locke-Spinoza connection further, there are some quasi-conspiratorial interpretations that are floating out there that have some traction, that Locke was some sort of secret Spinozist and he agreed with Spinoza fundamentally and everything, and he was hiding that from the world. I have no truck with those interpretations, but that's not to say that Locke didn't take some things from Spinoza in some meaningful way.
Thanks for your talk. You mentioned that Spinoza has kind of a higher form of reason than that based on the senses. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So Spinoza is historically classified as a rationalist, which means that he does not regard the ultimate foundation of knowledge as being in the senses. So the senses maybe have some practical uses, but if you want to talk about knowledge, certainty, proof, rigor, that's not ultimately going to be based on the senses. It's going to be based on, well, as I referred to, this higher form of reason, this intellectual insight. Ultimately, there's a limit to what I can do to elucidate that for you, insofar as this is ultimately a notion that's not grounded in reality. But if it's helpful to make this just a tad more concrete, Spinoza's book Ethics, which I've mentioned, was written in a geometric style. In other words, it was written like a traditional geometry textbook. So he laid out definitions, he laid out axioms, and then from there, he cranked out all of his propositions in which he was meant to prove his philosophy rigorously. And the axioms and the definitions, you're just supposed to be able to see that they're true. It's just supposed to be clear in itself, known through itself. And then as you deduce these things, you are knowing them on the basis of those original points. So something like geometry, very deductive, but yeah, ultimately, officially not supposed to be based in the senses.
So would you say that's like a Platonic influence, as you sort of mentioned?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, I do think that Spinoza's knowledge is, I suppose his view of knowledge is more Platonic. Yes. Do we have time for one more? Or are we done? We're done? Okay, we're done. Thanks, everyone.